if you go through Wa, you need to keep your head down, but also you'll notice that there are kids the age of, young teens with guns that you would genuinely see in a museum, wearing fatigues that make them look like they're wearing their dad's pajamas. It's pretty nuts. Like it is genuinely like going back in time.
How can I help? How can I be useful in ending needless suffering? Do not be afraid of work that has no end.
We have to organize a social movement.
We have an opportunity to lead by example versus just talking, hot air. I think the more people in this fight, the more we grow. Eventually it could change. The people are the ones that can make the change.
Welcome back to Change Agents, an Ironclad original, proudly presented by our friends just down the road at Montana Knife Company. This episode today, we're going to go deep into the world of Asia meth super cartels. I'm going to be doing this with journalist Sean Williams. He is the co-creator of the Underworld Podcast. We get to that at the end of the episode. And they explore organized crime around the world, specifically on that podcast. You might be asking yourself, why would I care about the meth trade in East and Southeast Asia? How big could it possibly be? Well, the number that the UN estimates is $80 billion. And we actually talk about how it goes beyond just the Asian epicenter, the tentacles that spread it around the world. Much of the drug trade that we're going to be talking about today is centered around a remote, autonomous area of Myanmar known as the Wa State. It's about the size of the Netherlands and is home to about 1 million people. The Narco-State has its own government, military, and even power grid, which is, of course, funded by the drug trade. How did you get interested in Asian cartels?
I had kind of danced around Southeast Asia for years, doing various different projects for years and years. So I'd been like a very circuitous route into journalism, and I'd been doing like conferences in Manila, these weird conferences. It's a long story, but I've been going to and from Southeast Asia for years and years. And like when you're there, that is the story, right? It's that there is this huge narco wave coming over, and it's coming from one particular spot, which is the jungle of the Golden Triangle, which is where Thailand, Burma, and Laos meet. And I guess the noise in my head grew and grew and grew, and I was like, right, I've got to find a way out to see this thing because it sounds crazy. And some of the figures you hear are just insane. I mean, there's cartels like 9 or 10 times the value of El Chapo and the Sinaloa cartel years ago. I doubt that's the case now, but and then I was covering the drug war in the Philippines in 2016. Crazy, thousands of people being dropped, government chasing cartels. It's just complete madness. This is all caused by the meth that is coming directly out of that region. And so my obsession grew and grew until I think it was like the end of 2019 or something like that when I got the chance to go out there. And it was exactly as bonkers and lawless and wild as I'd expected it to be. The trip there became a little bit more gonzo than I should have probably made it. But yeah, it was one of the most formative trips of my life. I had to go back there a second time because I'd had a bit too much fun on the campaign trail, shall we say. And so my lovely editor at GQ in London took me out for a beer and agreed that he would let me go a second time. And the second time, I still didn't get to see the machine, which is this giant meth factory that everyone talks about. It's kind of like a mythical place. But I did get very close to it, and the kind of failed attempt to get there took me winding and wending through all these different rebel groups and cartels. So that became the story. So yeah, it was a story of my own failure in the end as a journalist, but it was a really nutty trip.
So I had heard about the Golden Triangle, and honestly, it probably had come from movies, I would guess, maybe a documentary, but it had never been in an association with meth. I had always heard it in an association with opium. When did that flip occur? Or is it an equal product split at this point, or have they dove into, or I should say cannonballed into the bucket at this point purely on meth?
No, you get this inflection point in like the I would say like the early to mid 90s. So it was all opium from, I mean, like you going back way back to the turn of the century. Obviously, there was the opium wars of the 1960s. Vietnam was like fueling this huge industry of heroin coming down through the Golden Triangle on mules out through Thailand via GIs and other people, various assorted sort of ne'er-do-wells. Incredible stories. But in the 90s, that kind of flipped, and they there are these groups in the kind of hinterlands of Burma, bordering China, especially a group called the Wa, which is this sort of ethnic Chinese group, kind of backed up by the Communist Party. All of these different border groups have various allegiances in the region. It's like a patchwork, really complicated. And they start churning out these pills called yaba, which basically just means crazy pills, and it's early meth. Yeah, and they used to feed it to horses so that horses would go quicker and go for longer. This is literally what they did. And they were like, hold on a minute, this is great for people. I'm getting high as a kite and I can go on for like 24 hours at a time. Never mind the fact that I'm, want to kill everyone and I'm going to kill myself. But that kind of becomes the product. And then you get this synthetics industry with giant factories, usually manned by Taiwanese chemists. That's a whole history going back to the KMT and their fight against China and the drug war. And then this just grows and grows. And because of the industry that's been fermented during the various wars, during the Cold War, you get this kind of clique of very powerful narco warlords. And because they're able to control the industry so well, and because the Golden Triangle is such a lawless place, the government in Yangon barely controls the front lawn outside its own presidential palace. So this becomes so easy to grow a narco industry. And then meth becomes the product. And it takes over Asia very quickly. I mean, you've got meth epidemics in Singapore, Thailand, Korea, not to mention the Philippines. And it just, because there is the lack of violence or the lack of overt violence that there is in, say, the South American cartels, most of the time violence is bad for business. These cartels work with the governments, they work with the rebel groups. You've got factories rather that are essentially ring fenced by rebel groups that are then ring fenced by soldiers of the Burmese army. They're completely watertight operations. And then you get stuff like, Kansar is one of the most famous warlords. You get this guy, Say Chi Lop, who was recently arrested in the Netherlands. He's reckoned to be the richest drug lord in the world because they're not fighting each other. They don't have any competition. And they've just commanded this industry that's even making its way to the United States, despite the cartels making their own meth. That's how huge this thing is.
Yeah, I mean, certainly if there's no violence involved, there certainly seems to be a different business model than our neighbors on the southern border in Mexico. Not an expert on those cartels, but there is definitely a level of competition and knocking each other off. There's probably a little bit of a hypothesis, and based off of quite a few conversations I have, there's probably some overlay of government support on certain areas south of the border. Allegedly, everyone, don't put a hit out on me. I've just had too many conversations that kind of trend in the same direction. I'm like, that's happening where? Who's watching that go on? Yeah, but no violence. Yeah, I guess you could keep that under the radar a little bit more.
Yeah, it's like the stuff south of the border in Mexico, that's kind of characterized by big wars, right? And kind of violence on a horrific scale. Whereas this stuff, obviously there is violence. There's plenty of it in Burma to go around, but this is almost overtly state-sanctioned narco trafficking. The breakdown of Burmese government and society is the subject of several books, and I could go on for 10 hours about it, and it would probably bore your listeners to death. But essentially, everyone's in on the game, from the officers of the army to the government officials to business people. Everyone is skimming off the top of the meth industry, and that just serves to help the big kingpins, and it's helped them a hell of a lot.
Debatable, depending on, what side of that argument you are on, for sure. Yeah, it's helping those that are skimming. I bet you it's not helping the everyday person in Burma.
Absolutely not, no. And it just, the stories out of Burma just seem to get worse and worse by the day. I mean, there are rebel groups now down south near the capital that it looks like, I mean, I was reading a report on the BBC yesterday. It says that they reckon they're going to take over the country. And given the madness that goes on there, I wouldn't bet against it. I mean,
Yeah.
there are uprisings and protests and stuff that have just gone forever in that country. The government has never really had great control, nor has it ever opened up. So it's always been this weird clique of generals living in their fortress, just trying to siphon everything from the country, all its mineral wealth, all of the drug trade. They've even got this weird capital, Naypyidaw, that's not populated by anyone. It's a secret city. It has 10 lane highways with no cars. It's just a vehicle for the generals to get rich. Yeah,
Whoa.
it's nuts.
So you alluded to like this mega facility. You weren't able to see it yourself. Have you been able to talk to people who have actually seen it? Like, give me an idea of the size and scope and scale of this thing.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking, they call it inverted commas the machine. So that's the kind of moniker for it all over the country. Obviously, there are, dozens, maybe even hundreds of these things, and they vary in size. But some of the pictures that I've seen from people who have worked in them and some of the descriptions from people that I've chatted to, these are, picture your local power station. These are that big. They are gigantic, and they're pumping out billions of dollars worth of meth each year, and it's really on a staggering scale. So I've seen pictures of silos, and this really does look like your local manufacturing plant. They're such professional operations. They are, bivouacked and hidden in the jungles, on routes that in some cases go directly through towns, but everyone's so terrified that they won't speak about it. It's almost like it's like a ghost, that lives on the edge of the town. You will see the trucks going in and out. There was one particular village that I went to, and we were chatting to the locals, and they were it was almost like in a movie where they were saying, "It's not here," and then like motioning with their fingers like "It's over there." And you could see trucks rolling in and out, like you would do any construction site. And we were led to believe that they were just laden with drugs. And so we got very, very close. Me and a colleague of mine, he was writing a book about the meth industry at the time, and we actually sort of tagged along with a narco group at one point, and they sort of they kept us going for days and days, and they pwned us really. In the end, they sort of took the guns and the drugs and the money. One of them did, a couple of them did, and just ran from where we were. And so after this long trek, I think it had taken us about 2 weeks to get to this point in a very, very closed down village in the middle of nowhere, in a kind of what they call a black zone. So no foreigners are allowed there. We'd had to go in under cover of darkness. It was all pretty shady. We'd had to wait in a hotel for several days while this cartel were going, okay, well, tomorrow it's going to be the day. Tomorrow it's going to be the day. And it got a bit boring, basically. And by the end of it, we were told that one of the guys and his friend had absconded with a car full of drugs, guns, and cash. And they said, "Do you want us to kill him? We can cut off his head and send you some pictures on your mobile phone." We're like, "No, I think we can do without the beheadings. Please don't kill him on our behalf." Although at the time I did kind of want to kill him, but yeah. So it was.
That's not
a
good headline though. As for a reporter, that's a reporter requests man to be beheaded.
Yeah,
like, that's not good.
It's probably not best practice.
No, I bet it's going to get printed though. I mean, you definitely would trend.
Hey, I would definitely be trending, yeah, for sure. But possibly have no work coming in afterwards, or maybe tons. I don't know. I don't know how it works these days. But it was. We got very, very close, and we assumed that we even were in villages where we could see the kind of outer perimeter of some of these so-called machines. And we kept getting good sources who had promised to take us inside. Never quite happened, but through that journey, we kind of learned how a lot of these groups interact with each other, how the trade works, how they siphon the drugs out by, sea, land, and air. So it was an experience. It was an education. We didn't get to see what we wanted to see, but being there alone in some of these dark zones that no one's getting into, that was a privilege.
And in the end, for your own personal safety, it might be better that you didn't get incredibly close to that machine. You know, I mean, as you get closer, I mean, like, hey, we'll take you right inside, and they close the door behind you, and that's the last thing you ever see. So there could be a silver lining to what happened with you.
Yeah. And that's the thing with covering organized crime, right? Is that when you're covering conflicts and war zones, it is scary, it's terrifying actually, but you kind of know where the front lines are. You know who's fighting whom, you know why they're fighting each other. People, you know, if they're fighting and dying, they're dying for a cause. In organized crime, it's kind of harder to figure out those incentives. And that's one of the keys with all journalism of this kind, is seeing who has an incentive to do you harm or who has an incentive otherwise. And it's really, really tough when you're getting close to operations like this, because if you sat down quite soberly and thought about it, it would not behoove many of these people to allow you safe passage to these sites and allow you back out. So you never really know where you stand. And possibly it did suit us well, in good stead to not get into the machine. Although our route out was pretty weird too. We had to take a small boat along the Mekong that got stuck, and we had to sleep on the beach, and we could hear tigers. It was crazy. But that was probably safer than sticking around where we were.
I hope you are enjoying season 2 of Change Agents, which is an IRONCLAD original. And if you are a fan of the podcast, you know that we are presented by Montana Knife Company, which from where I am sitting right now is a short 2-hour drive, maybe 120 miles due south towards Missoula. I was first exposed to this brand through its founder, Josh Smith. And actually, when I first met him, I wasn't even aware of what Montana Knife Company was. He sat across the table from me. We had a conversation, and I have been a fan ever since. This was a few years ago, and the velocity and trajectory of that company is unbelievable. I directly associate that growth with who Josh is, what he stands for, and what he puts into his product. So a little bit more about Josh. He's been making knives for 30 years. They're made in the USA. They have a multi-generational warranty and free sharpening. They're design tested and they're built by hunters, and MKC's a hunting knife company first and foremost. They sell out their knives sometimes in under 60 seconds. And if you want to see what they have available or what's coming up, surf over to MontanaKnifeCompany.com. They have a new knife drop every Thursday at 7 p.m. Here's what I'm going to say on that. Practice checking out. As ridiculous as that sounds, you need to have your credit card information loaded and practice the checkout process, because they go like that. I cannot even count the number of times I have had a knife taken from my cart because somebody was faster to purchase it than I was. People ask me all the time, what's my favorite blade of theirs? I go with the Mini Speed Goat. It is my everyday carry knife. I don't use it for knife fighting. I use it for things that I need a knife for, so usually opening boxes. But it is my favorite blade, and if you're a fan of working knives made for working people, I highly suggest that you check out Montana Knife Company. And I'm going to add to that. Let's talk a little bit about the warranty. They have the best warranty program in the industry. No matter if you bought the knife from them directly, or bought the knife from a friend, or it was gifted to you, or if you even found the knife, they're going to honor the warranty for the life of the blade. How awesome is that? Couldn't be more proud to have them as the presenting sponsor of Change Agents. They are a fantastic organization. This time that you were talking about in the Black area, is this in the this autonomous WA state or region that you were talking about before?
Yeah, some of it was. Yeah.
Can you break that down and just talk about the dynamics of that area? Who's in control of the area? What kind of life is like in that area?
Well, firstly, it's extremely parochial and kind of pastoral. So these are villages, not towns, very spread out populations. Really, I mean, my latest knowledge of that area, I keep up to date, and I read and I listen to people that I speak to on the ground. But the areas change hands so quickly, it's mind-numbing. I would say there are easily at least a dozen groups in control of various patches of land there, including the Wa. And the Wa are probably the most ensconced and kind of concrete group there. But they have two separate enclaves in what is Shan State, which is the kind of easternmost part of Myanmar or Burma or whatever you want to call it country. and they are sort of covertly backed by China, which gives them a bit of an edge. If you go through WA, you need to keep your head down, but also you'll notice that there are kids the age of, young teens with guns that you would genuinely see in a museum, wearing fatigues that make them look like they're wearing their dad's pajamas. It's pretty nuts. It is genuinely like going back in time. Um, and the Wa have got wildly rich off the back of yaba or meth pills. And they want to keep it that way, which is why they don't let a lot of people in. There have been some cases in the past. I think a BBC guy got in a few years ago for some kind of a military parade. We were not allowed in, so we had to be quite coy about who we spoke with. Blacked out windows, just a regular sort of seven-seater van. Um, and it's hairy out there. I mean, the government doesn't even bother going in. They just leave these people to their own devices. So that's what makes Burma sort of conversely so difficult to report on, because there's so many different groups and it's almost impossible to write that down in a cogent and sort of readable way. But
Yeah.
also it's just manna from heaven for the narcos, because they can play each group off against each other. If there is a conflict, they don't have to worry about it. They'll just pay guys to secure the facilities. So it's just the perfect breeding ground for drug crime. And the figures are eye-watering that come out of there, like 17 billion, $20 billion, whoever you want to believe, it's gigantic.
So you're saying that one of these organizations is loosely affiliated or supported by the Chinese government. Why that particular sect versus others? What's the benefit that China is receiving from that connection?
A lot of these are historical, so they go back to the
Okay.
Cold War. I mean, a lot of Burma's history is wrapped up in the sort of Chinese nationalists versus the Chinese communists. A lot of allegiances were forged in the 40s and 50s at a time when it didn't even look like China might, remain a communist country. Maybe the nationalists won the country back. They were, of course, backed by America and its allies, the Chinese and the Vietnamese and Laotians and other communist forces joined hands on the other side. So you had this patchwork of hinterland tribes who were either, on the side of democracy, on the side of communism, and they kind of stayed that way, and they cemented over the years and calcified into the groups that we see today. Although they might not be overtly backed by the People's Army anymore, they still get a free pass to kind of do what they want, because it's useful, as we've seen in Ukraine and all over the world, to have a frozen conflict that screws up your enemies and just stays that way. So it's good for China to have a little bit of chaos on the border, just to keep things interesting. And that's kind of how the Wa and other groups have been able to cement control over the years. But that's changing, actually. That's actually changing in the last couple of years. China is pushing back on some of the drug crime on its borders, especially in Burma. Because
Why do you think that is?
I think they're getting cheesed off with the amount of people who are addicts now. I mean, there was a real issue with meth addiction in China. I think they cracked down in 2014. There's an element of cloak and daggers to this, right? Because the Chinese government is sort of backing the fentanyl trade to some extent. They're not really out there to necessarily rid the world of drugs in a kind of Nixon style way.
Are you saying that the Mexican cartels get their precursor chemicals from China, sir?
I would never cast aspersions on the good people of the eastern seaboard of China, but they have become quite annoyed at the level of crime that's going on their borders. So one of the weirder kind of symptoms of the Burmese drug war is that you get these lawless casino towns that pop up on the Chinese border. And in these sort of weird carved out special economic zones, they call them, but they're just criminal towns. I went to one of them. It's called the Golden Triangle, SEZ. It has this casino called the King's Romans, which is just like Sodom and Gomorrah. It's insane. I mean, underage sex work, wild animals on the food menus, money being laundered in unbelievable amounts. You can just see it. It's there. It's on the street. It's gross. And you get all of the meth traders coming through these SCZs. And so that is becoming so out of hand that even the Chinese government is going in and raiding some of these compounds now, because you get more digitized crimes now going on there. You get these slave compounds, people doing scam work who are trafficked. And as much as governments around the world, might have ulterior motives, nobody enjoys their own citizens being trafficked into slavery. So yeah, there's a few cases in 2022 and 2023 about the CCP going in, all guns blazing, and wiping out a few of these cartels. So that might continue, but with all organized crime, it just morphs and metastasizes and turns into something else. So who knows what will happen.
It's been rumored that the meth that they produce there is some of the best in the world, which leads me to believe they have very modern and a sophisticated operation. Is that ring true to you from what you've seen on the ground?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. They get chemists from parts of East Asia, very rich parts of East Asia, Taiwan, Japan, places like this. These are, this is not a kind of clapboard house in the middle of Oklahoma. This is proper stuff. Although the blue meth, that was a thing in Oklahoma, I think, when I was living there. So that's also.
What were you doing living in Oklahoma?
That's a long story that involves an ex-wife and a lot
Fair
of traveling
enough.
around. But yeah, but yeah, these operations are huge. They are very, very professional. So in some cases, this stuff is coming via submarines into the Bay of Manila. This is not coming down on mules like it might have done in the 60s. This is a fully mechanized industry.
Well, that was going to be my next question. If this is the origin, this area where this high quality, very sophisticated operation is taking place, where does it go from there? Where do the tentacles spread? Like, what is the scope and reach of this? I live in northwestern Montana. One of the main drugs that the police deal with here often is meth. We have the meth for the up and then the fentanyl for the down. I'm not advocating anybody use those for those particular reasons, but it seems like they have their way to lever in one direction and then the other. I've never talked to anybody, though, about the origin of the meth. I feel like it's probably, honestly, either homegrown or south of the border. I'm curious how far this operation has its tentacles out.
It's easy to tell the direction that it goes into Asia, right? Because I guess the biggest prizes for markup reasons are your richer Asian nations, Japan, Korea, Singapore. Tons of it there. It's caused kind of underworld wars in all of these countries. The biggest prizes, as they are for cocaine going the other way from the Pacific, are New Zealand and Australia, because the markups are unbelievable. The price for drugs in say Sydney, which I think is the world's richest drug market, it's even richer than New York or London.
Is it really?
Think the markup, yeah, I think the markups are like 4 or 5 times even what they are in those two cities.
Wow.
So doesn't matter what gets caught at the border, these guys will make a giant profit, which is why they're all fighting to get it through Indonesia and Malaysia, down into Papua New Guinea, over on the boats from PNG into Australia. The routes they're pretty intense. So the Asian side of it is sort of the majority of the trade. The meth that would be getting into the US is usually not coming from the Golden Triangle, although there are ethnic gangs in California. You've got your Cambodians, Laotians, stuff like that. They're bringing it in smaller amounts in a way that the DEA doesn't really give a shit about. But in Asia, it's all consuming. This is really the story of the drug industry there. And some of it gets into Europe as well. Obviously, Seichi Lop, the biggest narco in the world, he was arrested in Amsterdam. What the hell is he doing there? Well, he's bringing stuff in from the ports in Rotterdam and Antwerp. So this is a global trade, but the routes are slightly different than they would be for North America. And I mean, you can see in Montana some of the stuff that's coming sort of around and down or up through for the states is kind of mind blowing, right? And it's hitting that state worse than most at the moment.
Well, it is, especially out and recently through actually hosting this podcast, talking with people. One of the hardest hit areas, and it's targeted, are the reservations.
Yeah.
Going after the
Yeah.
indigenous population. Not only will they target that with the product itself, but then they'll target it as becoming a base of operations because they're a sovereign nation operating, under their own laws. It creates this legal issue, who has jurisdiction here, communication, all of that. But I'm good friends with a bunch of law enforcement, and the vast majority we see is coming from the southern border up the west coast of California, then through Oregon into Washington, and then making its way east. So not a lot yet coming in from the north, but I suspect that's probably just a matter of efficiency at this point.
I was jumped a few years ago at a gas station. What are some easy to use self-defense techniques?
What is the most cost-effective way to make sure my home is secure?
What would happen if there was a global internet or cellular outage? What is your suggestion for comms?
What should I do if I hear shots ringing out?
Or what I should do if there's a major terrorist attack.
How is your faith tied in to being a protector?
Is there a moral case for taking a life?
What is your recommendation on critical EDC?
What should I have? What's the best?
What should I do?
What does that look like?
What would you recommend?
Is there anything I could do?
Yeah, I heard your show in Montana, and I've been looking into it for a while. I mean, I want to get back out to Montana. I did a road trip there years ago, and it's the most beautiful place on earth. But
I recommend it and agree.
Yes, I mean, South Island of New Zealand and Montana is kind of comparable landscape in many ways. But I would say that the comparable thing there to what is going on in, say, Myanmar, Burma, is those reservations and is this kind of lack of jurisdiction. Not only are the reservations in Montana just so isolated and geographically, alone, they have this kind of, I guess they have the dual problem of who's in charge of law enforcement, and also we don't trust them. And that's the same thing as what's going on for the rebel groups or the ethnic minorities in Burma. I mean, you only have to look at what's happened to the Rohingya on the western side of Burma, that's been a genocide going back 20 years. Even longer. No one trusts the authorities. No one likes them. No one wants them in control. Everyone is invested in the ethnic groups trying to fight their own battles. Everyone knows someone that's involved in the drug trade because that is what fuels the separatist fights. And it's the perfect storm, which is why it's going to continue for a long time. There's no end to this in sight. I mean, you can arrest all the kingpins you want, but the stuff's going to keep rumbling around in the background.
If they, and I'll use that term broadly, let's say a coalition of Asian countries actually did want to shut this down, how would they do it?
They would have to stabilize Burma. That's the only way to do it. I think that for years, going back to the 40s, there have been efforts to democratize Burma. You've got Aung San Suu Kyi. She's national hero, although extremely tainted politically. There have been efforts by the US and various groups across Asia. I do actually agree. I think it has to be a pan-Asian solution. I don't think anyone's going to listen to the US or the UK or anyone else. But it's hard. I mean, these generals are entrenched. In the 80s, there was a huge protest, but all the generals were like, okay, we'll do democracy. But all they did is, swapped out their epaulets for shirts and ties. And they moved into government. They pretended they were a democracy, but they never were. And the only way to stop this trade is to stop all the fighting in the hinterlands, stop the generals being able to skim off the top of the drug trade. That's it. That's the solution. But that would involve a monumental effort and, of course, a lot of money. And governments don't want to spend money. So it doesn't really look like that's going to happen. I mean, that's the story of organized crime around the world, right? You can't solve it by cutting off the head. You've got to cut it off at the base. And if you don't solve the conflict and the poverty and the stuff that causes it, it's going to continue. Doesn't matter who's running it.
Yeah, I agree with you. I do believe that a lot of issues, especially geographically centered like this, if you can't stabilize the region and get the local countries involved in solving that problem, it's not something that the Western world probably has any even understanding of the complexity to even begin the solution. You go with the American solution, just say no to drugs. It's like, really? How's that working out for us?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, and then I have a show note. I have a show note in front of me too, saying, it's the CIA's role in helping these militia bosses first come to power in the 50s through 70s. Have you uncovered any role of, not that hypothetically and allegedly, of course, that the agency, and I actually understand exactly why they would do this. They can either run a proxy operation or a proxy war by having people and influence in that area, which is, I suspect, what happened. But have you come across any involvement from the agency back in that time period?
Oh yeah. I mean, we don't have to say allegedly. This is like the history of the region. It's one of the craziest stories in the world. I'm actually working on a scripted thing of my own about this whole history because it's bonkers. Essentially, there was no other way of making money in this region than growing opium, right? Going back to the 1800s and whatever. So as the Maoists fought the KMT, the Kuomintang, the Chinese nationalists, as they pushed them out of the country and turned China red, obviously in the late 40s and early 50s, America is desperate to stop the flow of communism into Southeast Asia, and that would get a lot worse. So they have these battalions of these kind of lost boys, these KMT soldiers, these Chinese guys who are desperate to take back their country from the communist hordes. And so the only way they can make money to buy guns, to fuel an insurgency is opium. And they, with the CIA, very, very openly fuel this kind of pipeline of drugs coming from the mountains of northern Burma down on the backs of mules and later years on mopeds into Thailand, where the US and other people had some front companies. There was one called Sea Supply that was run by a Taiwanese quadruple agent called Mr. Ho. And he was like an import-export guy. I mean, you couldn't make this stuff up. It's nuts. And they were ferrying this stuff down with the help of a secret army that the CIA had established to Mr. Ho. And Mr. Ho would then dispatch drugs out across the world with the help of Corsican gangsters. This is the so-called French connection of heroin at the time. So yeah, the CIA was deep into this stuff. And this continued into the 60s. I mean, Vietnam was fueling a horrendous epidemic of addiction throughout the States. But despite that, the Americans, CIA, various officials who are extremely well known and did very well afterwards, they were fueling it through something which was Sea Supply's kind of successor company, which was something called Air America, which was famously immortalized in a terrible film starring Robert Downey Jr. and Mel Gibson in, I think, 1990.
Opinions vary. I've seen it. I would give it a B.
I mean, I'm expecting so much from these two guys, and I'm like, oh my God. But this was a front that was run for, I think, 20 years, and it was running drugs, it was running guns, it was primarily running ammunition to fight the sort of anti-communist Vietnamese cause, and the secret war in Laos, which is a whole thing that I think surprisingly known less in America than it should be. But they were also funneling drugs because the drugs were the ways that the generals and the rebel groups were getting their money. There was no other way to make money. And this is all out in the open. You had really cool roving reporters in sort of stationed in Bangkok and various parts of Southeast Asia. They were just getting generals pissed and asking them questions about this stuff. And they're like, yeah, if there's the odd ton of opium going on board the planes, then we don't ask questions, and that's how they make money. So the US and even the people who were taking it out of, say, Bangkok, there's a very famous guy called Ike Atkinson, who was a black GI from North Carolina. In the film American Gangster, which is great, by the way, but half true, Frank Lucas goes to the KMT to pick up shipments of opium. That's not him. He never did that. He was always in Jersey. This was a guy called Ike Atkinson, a kind of demob happy GI, had served in Germany. And it was alleged that he was shipping out heroin packets in the bodies of dead GIs from the war.
Yeah.
That part of it is sort of the more dramatic bit, but there was a very, very well established train for drugs coming out of the region at that time, 60s, while the war was going. And Americans were involved in every single part of it. And there were Brits involved as well. It's crazy. It's really, really insane time in history.
This week on Borderland, an Ironclad original, Vince talks to Pinal County Sheriff Mark Lamb.
Because when you have one Border Patrol agent for every 200 people trying to cross the border, that was a unique situation. That was Texas National Guard standing there. What are you going to do when it's one Border Patrol agent by himself and 200 people come in? You know what the guy has to do? He's got to stand there like a matador and just let him in, because he has no chance. The guy doesn't even carry 200 rounds on him. What we saw there was really concerning to me, because it sends a strong message of how weak we are right now.
Watch new episodes every Monday wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube at This Is Ironclad.
It's interesting from a country, I'm proud of where I'm from, and I think everybody should be proud of where they're from. But I don't think that should excuse you from looking into the corners and behind the curtains every once in a while, just getting an understanding. First off, we could probably start with this. There is no country on earth that has a perfect track record. So maybe you shouldn't expect that the country that you are from has one. But the number of times that the U.S. government, through agencies, has gotten involved in situations like this, and I'm sure the initial idea was, we're going to fight communism without fighting communism directly. And now we have this golden triangle in a destabilized region that may never even be possibly stabilized again. And, we have these short-term tactical victories that end up with strategic, I'll let other people determine whether or not they are victories or losses. But we repeated it in Afghanistan as well. We backed the Mujahideen to fight off the Russians. And then the next thing you know, we're fighting against the literal weapons that we provided, because, the enemy of our enemy is our friend in that moment. And I guarantee you there were American troops that were killed by weaponry that was provided by Americans to fight the Russians. I don't have a solution for it, but damn, if the history of the United States and many other countries doesn't seem to repeat itself, you dig in deep enough, you're like, oh, this is a horrible problem. And you dig in, you're like, oh, shit. Yeah, that might have been a little bit of our fault.
We did it. Yeah, I'm British, so I know well that feeling. Look at the Opium Wars. Everything like that. But it's we're talking about perfect storms and creating these kind of industries back then in the sort of 60s and 70s. This was when Nixon was inaugurating the war on drugs. So there was very much a feeling, there wasn't kind of a modern understanding of addiction in any way. These were kind of outcasts, the people who were coming back from Vietnam, dope things. They were just sort of carbuncles in the country. They were treated as outsiders. No one, from what I've read, and I've done a lot of research into sort of the biographies of people who were involved in Laos and Vietnam back then, they didn't really think about the addiction problem the way that we might think about it now. They were able to compartmentalize it the way that Nixon did and be like, right, well, that's kind of the cost. The value of this is that we might hold back the tide of communism. We don't care about, mostly black and brown Americans who are getting hooked on this stuff in the inner cities. We don't really care about them. We've got this very sort of, kind of sort of puritanical view of drugs in a way. And that allowed them to justify overtly fueling the drug trade that was getting to the States. And one of the guys who I'm sort of obsessed with, I think he was the head of the Laos station at the time in Vientiane, and he had a horrific effect on the region, on the politics, on the people back home in the States. And he got promoted, and he was involved in Iran-Contra. So he went off to South America or Central America, and he did all kinds of crazy stuff afterwards. So they were getting rewarded for this shit. This wouldn't happen now, but that was just the kind of sentiment at the time. It was a black and white world, right? You had the baddies on one side and the goodies on the other. So anything you do to fight the baddies is all good.
Well, you can win all the battles, but still lose the war. And that's the problem with,
Yes.
I'm sure Well, I can't say that I'm sure. I would like to believe that those people had the best of intentions and motives, but I also don't think human behavior has really changed that much, and oftentimes people have their own self-interest in mind.
Yes, I think in this particular guy's, he doesn't come out well in anyone's book. His name is Ted
Yeah.
Shackley. If you read up about him, he is a bit of a wrong un, to say the least. He was just solely sort of madly obsessed with anti-communist causes to a point where he didn't really care about any people, even on his own side. He was involved in trying to kill Castro back in the day. I mean, he was real crazy guy. But there were other people who are very, very idealistic. There were people who were stationed in Southeast Asia at the time who fell in love with the region, who married into the culture, who spoke languages. There's a guy called Bill Young, who's a very famous CIA operative. He lived in the highlands of Burma, spoke all these crazy hill tribe languages. He fought the communists because he was a sort of evangelical Christian, and he thought that communism was godless and evil. But he really helped people. He had an idealistic cause. I think there was just a top layer where it became political, where people didn't really care for the locals. I mean, you hear a lot of people talking about fighting down to the last Ukrainian, this kind of language.
Yeah.
That's what the US was doing in Laos back then. It was really, they didn't, the political class didn't care. There were operatives on the ground who really cared, but their voices were kind of drowned out.
Ladies and gentlemen, today's episode is also brought to you by Mountain Tough. It's a unique functional fitness program that is, of course, supported by hunters and SEALs and Rangers and those from the special operations community. But that is not my favorite part of the Mountain Tough system or program. Although it was developed with insights from the backcountry hunter and veteran special operations community, there is an emphasis on more than just physical strength, which I believe to be essential. It is also about building an unbreakable mind. It is easy to build muscles from the neck down. It is far more difficult to build muscles from the neck up and the resilience between your ears. The Mountain Tough app provides the best functional fitness program directly to your phone, tablet, TV, or a web browser. So you really don't have an excuse to say, oh, I didn't know what I could be doing or should be doing, whether it's a program or inspiration or insight. It's all right there at the touch of your fingers. Some of you might be saying, well, I'm not a ex-special operations personnel. I'm also not a backcountry hunter. That's okay. For those of you who might not start out as an elite athlete, but you want to improve wherever you may be, Mountain Tough is determined to push everybody's limits. And they're going to meet you where you are with thoughtful programming, helping you achieve elite status through progressive fitness focusing on longevity, injury prevention, and holistic development. It's a story arc from wherever you are, getting as close to elite as could possibly be. So what are you waiting for? You can join the global Mountain Tough community right now. A community of people transforming their lives, bodies, and minds. Download the Mountain Tough app today and start training to always be ready for whatever it is you're trying to be ready for the backcountry, for the mission, or just life's unexpected challenges. Because when it comes to being prepared, there's no excuse to not start now. You can use the code CHANGE, which I'm looking at all capital letters, one word, at mountaintough.com on the monthly plan to get your first month absolutely free after your 14-day free trial. That's 6 weeks free to dive in, test the waters, the programming, and make sure it's actually for you. What are you waiting for? You can change your life today. Be ready for the mountains, the mission, and just life in general. Tell me about your Underworld project. What kind of stuff are you guys looking at?
Oh man, we do all kinds of stuff. It's really a privilege. Yeah, I mean, we've done a lot of stuff on Golden Triangle drugs, obviously, because that doesn't get covered a lot. And the stories involved and the people there are nuts. It came together because me and Danny, my co-host, we both worked on kind of organized crime stuff. We were both interested in that stuff for the same reasons, mostly because it sort of underpins the modern economy and our culture in a way that's hidden and I think not looked at enough. And also, I got into organized crime reporting because I found that the access was far easier than, trying to speak to politicians and stuff that staff writers would do. I'm a bit of a stringer gun for hire, so it's harder for me to get access to people like that. You can just speak to people down the pub or people on the street, and you can get the best stories about organized crime. And so we wanted to do stories that really exposed the inner workings of this in a way that's a little more journalistic. We do stories about the American mafia, wise guys in Brooklyn, that kind of stuff. But we also do stories about North Korean counterfeiting, or we did a show recently about a guy called the El Chapo of the Sahel, who's like West Africa's leading narco, but also obviously because he's in the Sahara Desert, he's involved in ISIS and Al-Qaeda and all kinds of groups there where terror and crime merge. These lesser known stories are really, really fascinating. I mean, you could go into Guinea-Bissau, a narco-state in West Africa. You could go into, I think you did recently stories on Ecuador as well, which is fascinating how that's become the sort of the dumpster fire that it currently is.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, we wanted to do stories with a bit more meat and look into, yeah, some of the kind of undercurrents that underpin this stuff and the characters that maybe don't get the airtime that they deserve. So yeah, it's been a really, really cool project. We've been going, oh God, like 3.5, 4 years now.
He's probably running out of material. The world is just writing itself.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there are no criminals left to cover. It's done. It's over.
The more you look into those networks, it sounds like you're looking at all over the globe. And the more that you do that and you look at organized crime, are you finding that these networks are defined by their similarities, or are they vastly different?
No, I'd say it's the former. I think that the conditions in which they emerge and form power, they're pretty much identical throughout the world. People turn to crime because they don't have any money, basically, or they want more money, or they want more power. Same as anyone, forming a business would do. It's just that some economies are easier to grasp for people who are cut out of society. A lot of, gangs from Brooklyn to Berlin to South Africa, they tend to come from maligned groups or immigrants who didn't have a footing in society or weren't given one. That's a very common theme that runs throughout. Governments being a bit shaky and corrupt. I mean, that's something that I think anyone around the world can empathize with, and that's one of the main things. So I think, yeah, whether the interesting things are that you can tell the story of a nation through its criminal groups, and in many cases, I've been out to Nigeria and followed the Nigerian mafias there. You can tell the story of modern Nigeria through its criminals a lot better than you can tell it through its legitimate, inverted commas, politicians. And I think that's one of the most arresting things about following crime, is that a lot of times you can learn a great deal more about a country through its criminals than you can do its non-black market.
One thing I think that frustrates people sometimes, and actually frustrates probably not the right word, I think overwhelmed. Like, we can talk about what's going on in the Golden Triangle, and people will say that sounds shitty, but it's not impacting me. Because, like I said, where I live right now, I guarantee you some of the friends I have on shift are dealing with either meth or fentanyl or both. They all have Narcan all over their cars just for the fentanyl epidemic that has made its way to Montana. How do we break this down into things that matter for people where they live? Do you have a suggestion?
Yeah.
Because I think that's what's important. Like, hearing about something across the horizon, actually, probably for lack of a better term, you start losing that ability to get people to buy in because it doesn't have teeth for them. But there are issues like this probably everywhere. Where would you start people just on a journey to educate themselves?
I would say, and it's one of my big gripes about the media industry, is that we are very ready to say follow the money, which is like, good practice for journalism, but we don't join the dots in a kind of narrative way that helps people understand how the most mundane crimes can affect their daily lives. I mean, I think that if I were to say to anyone, how to educate yourself about this stuff and what the media is getting wrong, I think that we don't look at financial crime enough. There's a fact, I think, there's a book by Oliver Bullough, who's a British journalist, and he wrote a great book called Moneyland. And I think it's like $1 in every $6 in the world economy is dark, right? So it's in criminal hands, it's off the books. I mean, we don't draw the lines between that and what that money could do even nearly enough. I mean, it's a real failure of journalism to, not talk about the fact that, what is it, like $1.52 trillion could be back solving any problem on earth. It could solve everything. I think that local corruption, political corruption, stuff like that, it might not be as sexy as the bang bang cartel stuff that they are good stories, but they affect people's lives more. A lot of cartel crime is kept to the cartels. A lot of financial crime will empty the coffers of states and governments and ruin them. So I think that when we're telling stories about crime, and we're telling stories about how criminal cartels wash their money and take them off the books, I think that I always want a little bit more from those stories that shows how XYZ community in, northwestern Montana is directly affected by that because they haven't had the money to build a bridge. I mean, I think that's really, it's hard to tell that story. It really is. But it has to be more of the conversation because every time that a drug cartel is whisking money into a shipping operation, they're taking it out of the tax base and they're taking it away from people. So it's not just about addiction and the problems of violence. It's the financial stuff. It's like follow the money. So yeah, that's something that I would like to inject more into my work, but it's also, I think, something that we could do better as an industry.
I hope everybody enjoyed today's episode. I think the best resource and reference to follow Sean's work is going to be his podcast that we discussed at the end, The Underworld. I highly recommend listening and subscribing. Thank you, everybody, again, for listening to and supporting Change Agents, which is an Ironclad original, again presented by our friends just down the road near Missoula, Montana Knife Company. We'll be back next week with an all-new episode.